Okay, having observed my parents' relationship, my first attitude towards sexuality was to avoid it. Um, there was no doubt about it that it brought up sensitive feelings. And there was no doubt about it that I didn't know what I was doing, and that other people, as a general statistic, didn't seem to have a lot of success knowing what they were doing around sex either. In other words, if you take 20 people who have sex, let's take 100 people who have sex for the first time, and then you look at what percentage of those 100 people feel great about it afterwards. A week or a couple of weeks later, it's not a terribly high percentage. There's ambivalence, there's I'm never doing that again, what a jerk, all this kind of stuff. And so who wants to be treated with ambivalence or called a jerk or any of that? So first step was abstinence. And the next step was to explore sexuality with an older and more experienced partner. Now, I read about this in some of the Amazonian tribes where it was common for a first love to be an older and more established partner or couple. And this made a lot of sense to me. And it seems like someone should know what they're doing when you're doing something that has such a high propensity towards disaster. And also, I never bought into the idea that I, as a man, was mostly interested in sex. I thought that was a ridiculous idea. What I was mostly interested in is a kind experience that left both people feeling better later. That you would feel closer to the person, more pleasure, etc., emotionally, mentally, and physically. And I also, of course, observed all of the mixed messages, meaning women would flirt and their body would express longing or pause as if to open up for, a physical touch of some kind, while if you say, well, are you attracted or do you want to be sexual? They say, oh, no, that's way too soon or whatever. And so there's obviously a lot of disintegrated energy, mentally, emotionally, and physically. So emotionally, you might be very lonely and want to be drawn to someone. Physically, of course, touch is always pleasurable if it's regulated to touch in the way the other person wants to be touched. But then mentally, there's all these bizarre rules that have nothing to do with your overall well-being, but have a lot to do with cultural judgments. And I realized that one of the biggest pitfalls was one or the other. For example, on the one hand, as a guy, being told culturally that I was just interested in sex, that I would believe the culture and always say yes to sex, and in fact feel hurt feelings and miserable. In fact, but be told culturally that I scored. Well, what's the score if I feel hurt feelings and miserable? That doesn't sound like a score at all. It sounds like a poor choice. Or on the other hand, really enjoy a sexual experience, but culturally be told that that wasn't the right type of person, or this makes me a slut, or whatever, this. So it seems like the culture goes both ways, encouraging sex that shouldn't happen and calling it a score, and on the other hand, judging sex that is perfectly intelligent. There's, for example, well, don't get involved with someone on a rebound. Well, why the hell not? If they're desperately lonely and that would comfort them and you don't mind helping out in that capacity, meaning, You understand they're lonely, you'd like to comfort them, and it does. Well, why avoid that? That's when they need comfort, a sense of love and belonging the most. The endorphins, the chemicals, seem to provide that. Now, the next thing that I understood was that I believed in a philosophy that whether one had a vagina or a penis should not be the determination of a good relationship as much as the quality of friendship, which is the goodwill of both people involved. So theoretically, I believed in bisexuality, meaning I believe it's more intelligent for two men or two women that are good friends, that care about one another, to be in a primary relationship, regardless of the level of touch, sexual or otherwise, than it is for two people that feel peak arousal, but that are incredibly cruel to one another. Meaning, in my ranking, I would put spending time with someone who's kind and healthy ahead of peak arousal. And if you feel arousal to both, you should pick the person who cares the most about themselves and the most about you, and they often go hand in hand. And so heterosexually, that's where my peak arousal is. But I noticed in my teen years a certain amount of curiosity, wanting to be affectionate and tender with boys my own age. And I noticed that seemed to make them uncomfortable, primarily on cultural grounds, which seemed disappointing. So I never really got to explore, what that would be like if it weren't for the fear I think they had of being found out or what that meant. That is, of course, a tragedy. We need more men having affectionate, caring relationships with one another and less men shooting each other. I don't think that's a bad direction to head as a species. And so it's particularly irritating that cults insist on stigmatizing male or female affection of any kind. Then there's also, the whole thing about the species. Generally, I believe that the planet would be in a better place if we had 1 or so billion less people than 1 or so billion more people. And more diverse, gay, lesbian, etc. relationships would tend to move the species in that direction. And then this I won't even waste time with the whole Christian judgment of all of that, which really suggests an incredibly shallow deity. If a deity truly, that is obviously non-physical, is more concerned with whether someone has a penis or a vagina than whether or not there's well-being and caring amongst human beings, it's obviously a pretty shallow deity, not terribly worth paying homage to. Having discovered the pleasure and benefit of a sexual relationship, I would say that I still focused a lot more on communication, mostly because people talk all the time. They interact all the time. About 5% is sexual. If you add up the amount of minutes you spend in a long-term relationship with someone, and then say, okay, how many of those minutes were spent having intercourse, and how many of those minutes were spent talking, having dinner, watching a movie, cuddling, etc. Well, you understand that the idea of basing an entire relationship around the 5% of the time that is sexual is at least questionable, and didn't make any sense to me. So communication came first. Then, I took some workshops on sexuality and exploration and learned how to negotiate a safe sex conversation, learned how to make requests, state boundaries, ask permission, and that all made sense to me, and so I've always done that. And then there was the thing around age. I found it fascinating that I was given flack for choosing a woman twice my age, but if as a man I choose a woman half my age, I might be praised. Well, it's obviously a little bit, asymmetrical. The same arguments apply. If you're a young woman and you choose an older man, there's a trade-off as a general rule. More wrinkles, more experience, better communication skills as a general rule. If there is a successful template of life, then life is more successful in older age. If there's a failed template of how to live, then you're worse off in older age. But there's generally a trade-off of experience versus pertness of skin. And if you don't have a lot of experience and you want to grow, if you're playing tennis, you play with someone a little better than you, not someone worse than you. It ruins your game. And so why not honor the young person who chooses to play with someone more experienced? They will generally grow faster. And what about the other way around? My wife is one of the few lovers who is, roughly half my age. So in that sense, I started off at her age dating someone twice my age, which I thought was a good choice. And now I'm in romantic relationship with someone half my age. I think it's a good choice for both of us, and that can be reevaluated with each passing year. The argument about dying together is largely superficial in the sense that I would say 95% or more of all sexual relationships end for reasons other than death. So we're not having this horrible problem of, 98% very, very happy people who want to live in bliss and harmony for the rest of their lives, and they do everything possible to live until the very end, and then poof, one of them dies and the other one is left heartbroken. No, we have the exact opposite experience. People getting together of the same age and not often lasting more than a month. And then doing that again and again. And so that, one woman in her 60s, who I was quite attracted to 10 years ago, rejected me. And she called me back 10 years later. She said, I've dated 200 guys since I rejected you. And I was a fool. You were exactly what I wanted, but I thought I should date someone my own age. I've just spent 10 years with people my own age I haven't particularly enjoyed, and are you available? And I said, no, I'm married. And so, that I think ageism is a pretty lame excuse to avoid a compatible friendship with whatever degree of touch is mutually pleasurable. Then I discovered transcendent sexuality, which, is some of the most magnificent terrain in human consciousness I've ever explored, and it's absolutely, amazing. The idea of the body being a multi-dimensional doorway through which to access the full terrain in human consciousness is a phenomenal paradigm. And when it happens organically and one is lifted into transcendent states, some of it psychic, some of it in states of ecstasy and bliss, and there's deep healing that's able to be occurred. I mean, this is phenomenal. And this is also, having explored this, why I think that honoring sexuality is such an important idea. Sexuality is in many ways an accelerant. It pours gas or energy as an amplifier on whatever pattern is in place in the relationship. So if you hate yourself, the odds are you'll hate yourself more after sex. If you are really good friends and you really care about each other more than having sex, etc., the odds are you will care about each other more after sex. If you are very conscious and you want to become more conscious, the odds are you will be more conscious about yourself and your partner after sex. So sex is an amplifier. And if you think of it as an accelerator, then the question is, are you in front of a brick wall and going to total the vehicle, or are you on an open highway that can benefit from rapid acceleration safely, which is one of the reasons why I think that particularly for men and sociopathic women, it is important to establish a strong sense of intimacy and caring. Now, this can be done in a matter of 5 hours. A number of my sexual couplings have been within 5 hours of meeting someone, or 5 hours of a container of quality time. But it's not 5 hours of random chit-chat and avoiding anything deep. This is 5 hours of a safe sex conversation, intention, clarity around boundaries and expectations, a clear sense of how to end the container or how long it will last, a sense of understanding preference, the framework of full transparency around feelings, of full transparency around positive and negative experiences, the genuine sense that we both care about one another more than we care about getting off. And in that framework, it can be an incredibly kind and healing experience, be it a one-off, a weekend, or whatever. And that is fine. You can spend 6 months meeting someone randomly at a bookstore and saying, hey, how are you? And that's still too soon to have sex because you don't know any of that. You haven't had a safe sex conversation after 6 months. You haven't established a rapport. You don't understand each other's intentions. You don't have a sense of... So, in 10 years, you can have a disastrous first sexual experience. It has nothing to do with how long you have had shallow conversations with one another, and everything to do with the skill and respect with which one enters the terrain. I've also explored monogamy and open relationships. I default towards monogamy, but I prefer open relationships to sexual frustration. And it's not even sexual frustration that bothers me as much as time frustration. If someone wants to be a primary partner but doesn't have time to listen to how I'm feeling that day and doesn't have time to spend time doing this and this and this, then they don't earn the right to be a primary partner, because the biology of a primary partner is often who you spend the most quality time with. So if you spend 8 hours a day of quality time with your boss and say, oh, you can't have sex at work, and then you go home to a little weekend fling that you've had for a couple of years where you have some hot sex and get drunk on the weekend or something, that's not your primary partner. That's not who really knows your ins and outs, who sees you under stress. That's a vacation relationship. Your primary relationship is with your boss, because that's who you will empathize with, the person you spend the most quality time with. Now, based on that, again, I've been very clear around, one, I prefer monogamy, and I prefer spending 30 hours of quality time a week with a monogamous partner, one-on-one. That's a good, healthy investment in intimacy, and it ensures that I will be attuned to their body more than anyone else's body, and they will be attuned to my body. It ensures very few secrets if you're spending 30 hours a week with someone else. I mean, I marvel that people are surprised that these secret lives develop when they spend 4 hours a week with someone. Well, that's a tiny amount of time. You think you're going to know everything about them when 90% of their time is out of your view? If you want to know everything about them, spend most of your time with them. And there's no need for secrets and lies. You know them. If you see them flirting with, half the people they encounter in that, 30 hours a week, they're a flirt. There's nothing shocking about it. And if you enjoy them flirting, then go at it and enjoy dating a flirt. If you can't stand someone flirting with someone else, then don't pretend that you've picked the right partner. And so this also is pretty clear. So open relationships are great when 2 or 3 people want to spend 4 or 5 hours a week together, and it's honest. This is a dating relationship. I'm going to be seeing other people because you don't have the time to prioritize this relationship. We vote with our feet, not with our platitudes. You want a quality time committed relationship, show up with quality time. Oh my gosh, I'd have to restructure my life. That's what we all do as we vote with our schedules. So that's my general thing around sexuality. I'm also pretty interested in transparency. And so some women like it if I tell them what I think of other women. Some people don't. I like to be an open book. That's something I like hearing and being. And it just seems to me that if someone can't stand hearing a noticeable part of who I am, then it's probably not good for a optimal primary relationship. If it's a secondary relationship, I don't have a problem with saying, okay, I don't talk to you about this, but we are secondary relationships. We're not pretending to know and be the be-all and everything for one another. I enjoy tennis with you and perhaps some cuddling or sexuality after the game, and you like that as well. And so that's our relationship. You don't have to know that I like metaphysics over here. The metaphysician doesn't have to play tennis. That can be, separate. And there is definite value in growth in a conscious, healthy, mutually negotiated, open relationship. It is not without, I guess the main thing I experienced was high maintenance. That to have 3 or 4 girlfriends was high maintenance. Because they might be fine with it coming in, then their feelings would deepen, they still wouldn't want to commit the time, and then they'd find another monogamous boyfriend. So there was more transition, more beginning and closing. Within a year period, I think, in an open framework, I dated like 10 people, whereas in the last 3 years with my wife, 1 person. I've been sexual with 1 person, and so I haven't had to get to know 10 different people. And so that's kind of some of the pros and cons.